Until the pandemic came and hit us, I think a lot of people were not quite so aware as to how much our lives are impacted by global events that might start anywhere.
This is a real crisis.
I mean, it's been clear that this was likely to spread in the U.S.
We need to be thinking much more ambitiously.
Climate finance is a very big issue.
We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
CGD came about because it was time to focus not only on what developing countries should do, but much more on what the rich world should do.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
Some of our previous work has helped to come up with a kind of innovative financing mechanism that was used to help launch pneumococcal vaccines. We really have researchers and experts here at CGD who come at these issues from multiple vantage points, and I think that's just what helps make our research more rigorous, more rich, and actually more connected to the realities that decision makers are grappling with.
We've been looking to CGD for all of your research and analysis to guide us.
So CGD is nonpartisan. Because of that, over the years, that credibility has given us significant convening power.
Our government highly values the work.
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
Every single time that we're able to get it right, it means we're reducing significant poverty.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Well, it's not morning even here. I keep saying morning. It's afternoon here. Today, I'm really excited about today because I get to discuss a book I love very much with someone of whom I have great respect for and of whom I'm pretty fond, Charlie Robertson. We're going to get into the book shortly, but for everyone here today, welcome. If you have questions, if you have comments, please, we invite your questions and comments to submit your questions and comments via YouTube, Twitter using hashtag CGD Talks. Really, really pleased to welcome Charlie Robertson. Charlie is to discuss his new book, The Time-Travelling Economist, Why Education and Fertility Are Key to Escaping Poverty. He is the global chief economist and head of market strategy at Renaissance Capital. But Charlie actually cut his teeth looking at Eastern Europe, right?
That's right.
Yeah, Eastern Europe. And then now he, for the last, I'll let Charlie date himself. For a while now, Charlie has focused on frontier markets, mainly in Africa, but all Pakistan and other places. And there are few people with the personal experience, the education, and the professional experience who are more qualified to write this book. And that's why I'm really, really excited I get to discuss the book with Charlie. Charlie, welcome to CGD and welcome to the Book Talk.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. It's now like 25 years experience in financial markets. So I guess one of the things that makes this book different is that it's not from the normal academic background, although it's priced a bit like an academic book, and I'm sorry about that. I did beg for them to be as cheap as possible, and it's got a whole financial market kind of experience. But I think that's partly where some of the most important discoveries in the book came about, because I look at it as an economist who works for a bank, who talks to clients who say, what's my return on capital, and how can I get, what interest rate am I going to get? And it was those questions which kept on coming up that ended up being so important in what I'm saying in the book.
Thank you. Part of the reason why, I mean, regardless of how long it's taking to write the book or what the timing was, it couldn't be more fortuitous. we're at this point where, for the first time, China is going to be a part of a credit committee to discuss debt in Zambia. There are lots of other countries that are looking at the global framework and seeing how the Zambia thing plays out to see if they can participate in it. But African countries have to, frontier markets have to deal with debt. To control inflation in the global north, central banks, especially here, the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates, which will affect the cost of borrowing for poorer countries. That itself will have implications for credit ratings, right? And so we're going to talk about that. But before we get into the book, I was just saying those things to say that the book is just as relevant today as when you first started writing the book, of how your first manuscript. I wanted to start by giving you an opportunity to do an overview of, what are the key things you want us to get from this book? What are the things you wanted to communicate? And then we'll get into the conversation. So over to you, Charlie.
Yeah, there was basically, I've been sitting at conference after conference for a decade and hearing a lot of reasons are consistently given. Almost doesn't matter which country I go to, about why Africa's poor. And actually, it's not just something you get in African conferences. You get it in Pakistan. You've had it in Bangladesh. And 10, 20 years ago, you were still getting it in China. So I went through all of those arguments over the years and kept on finding that they weren't giving me the answer as to why the poverty's still there. And I guess part of my interest in this is that, my background was experiencing power cuts in Cornwall, the poorest county in the UK, back in the 70s when I was a kid. And so seeing power cuts in Rwanda or Nigeria or now South Africa, I've been there. I've been there at that bit where you're trying to light a candle and remember where the matches are to light it up because you've got nothing else to do in the evening. And I guess there was a focus on education that came about from probably my gran disappearing off when she got tired of the childcare and going off and reading books, and I'd discover in some corner room deep in some story. So I got some sense that education could make a difference, and certainly made a difference in my life, that I got out of Cornwall, came to London, got the job I had thanks to education. So I'm really conscious of how important it can be on a personal level. And I think what's really interesting about the data I'm going to try and show you now is that it shows up at the macro level too. So Erin, if you could pull up one graph. The first chapter is about education. And what I've found so fascinating about this is how long the lag is, the benefits of good education, or even actually just basic education are. So this chart here is showing you literacy, adult literacy. Can you read or write? 4 sentences. Farming is hard work. Can you read or write that in any language, your local language? And if you can, you're considered to be literate. And of the there's 20 countries there I'm showing. You don't need to see the details. It starts off in 1950. Only one of them had more than 40% adult literacy, which is Mauritius. And I could take that column of data and I could show it to 16-year-old students studying economics in a UK college just 2 weeks ago. And I could say, which country is the only one, is the richest of those 20 countries today? And after they've heard the full presentation, I'm just giving you a little snapshot here. They all say, well, it must be Mauritius. And the only country I'm not showing which had higher literacy than Mauritius in 1950 was Seychelles. The only country richer of all the countries in Africa, the only one richer than Mauritius today is Seychelles. So it's really kind of amazingly important. And what I'm showing on that slide was that for the next 30, 40 years, the adult literacy rates were not at the 70 to 80% rates you need to industrialize. And countries starting with Singapore, Hong Kong, the Asian dragons back in the 80s, 4 countries with Taiwan and South Korea did get adult literacy up very fast, and then they were able to take off. So that's part of the argument. And in fact, I show a quick map. This is my hand-drawn map of adult literacy in Africa, and the green are where countries now have 70 or 80% adult literacy. The grey is where it's under 40%. And the grey is countries like Guinea on the left-hand side, or Mali, both of which have had coups in the last 18 months. Somalia on the right-hand side, which has still got a lot of civil strife. Apart from those countries, the bulk of the continent has certainly got to a level where they can grow and where countries can grow, but better still, they're at the 70 to 80% where they can industrialize, and that's when people really take off. But the question then is, well, why haven't they? Why aren't we seeing industry across Africa? Why aren't I buying? Why isn't my iPhone made in Kenya, say? And then it comes to the next map, Erin, which is a map of electricity. Here, green is good. Green again is plenty of electricity, enough to supply a factory, so that your literate people can move to that factory and get a job. And the dark grey is where it's way below what we see in any country industrialized with. There just isn't enough electricity. And I had a long argument then in Nairobi, I think, in 2018 with a banker. And I said, Kenya's problem, as an example, good education, became green on that map, and now grey on the electricity. And they just have to build more electricity. And the Kenya guy turned around to me and said, yeah, but it costs so much. Our interest rates are double digit. We're not China with 2% interest rates. China's got so much money, they are flooding the rest of the world with it. And some of the debt problems we're having right now is because the Chinese have got so much money. So why? Why have the Chinese got so much money and the Kenyans not? And then we get the third, and this is where it gets really controversial, map, and it's about fertility rates. And what I found was a paper talking about the rise of savings in China, and it happening when their fertility rate dropped from 6 kids per woman in 1970 to 3 kids per woman by 1980, and then continued to fall. And after that, the fertility rates today in Nigeria, dark grey, about 5 to 6 kids per woman. DR Congo also about 5 to 6. Angola about 5 to 6. There's very few countries where the fertility rate's as low as it is in East Asia, and they are places like Morocco or Mauritius. Now, Morocco and Mauritius, and we can drop the map now. Morocco and Mauritius, the interest rates are about 2%. And if you go to Morocco, you've got fantastic trains, you've got excellent electricity, you've got beautiful big roads, the infrastructure's all there. Mauritius has had the infrastructure now for decades. So this isn't an Africa versus Asia story. In fact, it's a high fertility versus a low fertility story. So if you go to Pakistan versus Bangladesh, they were the same country until 1971, East and West Pakistan. Now, Bangladesh got the fertility rate down to 2 kids per woman, and they have never borrowed a Eurobond. Pakistan, fertility rate's 3.5, and their adult literacy rate, the education's not as good either. It's about just close to 60% adult literacy versus over 70, nearly 75 in Bangladesh. But the combination means that Bangladesh has its own savings. Pakistan doesn't. Pakistan borrows Chinese savings. And so what I have then worked out, or what I have to conclude from this, is that the high fertility rates we're still seeing in a lot of countries are encouraging governments to go out and borrow from abroad where it seems cheaper, to try and build the infrastructure they want, to help create the jobs. And the risk is that leads to a debt crisis. The last time we saw this, of course, was Latin America in the 1980s, when they were high fertility countries. There was only 2 that weren't back in the 60s and the 70s. They were Uruguay, the richest country in South America, and Chile, which has for many decades now been seen as the great emerging market Latin American story. And I think it really comes down to lower fertility rates. And they ended up going into a big debt crisis in the 1980s. But the good news for Latin America was education numbers were good enough by the 80s that debt crisis didn't wipe out Latin America for like 20 years. The 1990s, they could come back. In some cases, it took a few years longer for a couple of others. Sub-Sahara really suffered in the 80s. They had the high fertility problem and the debt crisis then, and the education numbers weren't as good. Today, the education numbers are better, so I'm less worried from that side. But I guess the key point of the book here is that we've got 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and that just feels like about at least 14 too many. And what I'm trying to argue here is if governments just focus on educating, on supporting a lower fertility rate of around 2 to 3. Don't go too low. Don't do a China and East Asia, go down to 1. Then that creates all of its own problems of getting too old before you get rich. But try and target that 2 to 3 range. And then you have your local savings. Then you don't need foreign money anymore. Then you don't need the Western bankers. You don't need Chinese loans. You don't need that stuff. People, countries can stand on their own 2 feet. And that's the core message of the book, I think.
This is fascinating, and I'm glad we get to talk about this, because what I'm hearing is that, and this is what you say in the book, that the time travel is that when you arrive in a country, if you have these 3 data points available to you, it can tell you not just where you are, but when you are, right, in that country's development trajectory, in this thing that we call structural transformation, where we go from a low-income economy to a middle-income to a high-income one, from an agrarian one to one that produces manufactured goods or services, and to be able to do that. And you're saying, look, just because we watch the same TV shows, we use the same phones all over the world, doesn't necessarily mean as a group or as regions or as countries that we are in the same time. And these 3, high fertility, low literacy rates, and low power,
electricity,
this is like the witch's brew of persistent poverty, right? These
Absolutely.
3 continuing to interact lead us to persistent poverty. So I want to go into each of these things. So first is that in most settings, when Africans talk about the poverty, we'll come to the governance issue later, but one of the places most Africans like to begin the conversation, of course, is about colonialism, right? That colonial relationships sort of created this negative momentum, and this momentum has built its own inertia, and this is why we're here. And one of the ways people point out to these colonial relationships is that the terms of trade between Africa and the rest of the world is disproportionately against Africa's interests. So, for example, we send out, chromium, we send out bauxite, and then we import chrome, we import aluminum, we import steel from iron ore, or we send out cocoa and we bring back chocolate. And so because we're not adding value, we're getting less for what we do. And you're saying that the value, Africa's wealth is not in the soil. Africa's wealth is, what do you mean by this? And for someone who's reading the book and like, what do you mean by Africa's wealth is not in the soil? It's not beneath the soil.
I guess the most important thing I'm trying to get at is that it's people, and if you can unleash the potential of its people through basic education, change happens. There was a great study about just talking about migration here, but it was looking at Nigerian villages in the 1970s, and the people who left the village were literate. They'd gone to primary school and they'd achieved literacy, and then they go off to the city to try and get a good job. If you don't have even literacy, you don't leave the village. And it was like, I can't remember the exact numbers, it was something like 98% of people who stayed in the village were illiterate, and 98% who got some education left for a better life. So my point being is that people can go out and find opportunities when they've got education. But the difficulty is that if you haven't got local savings in a country, and the way I look at this, I look at deposits in the banking system. If your deposits in the banking system are 20% of GDP, because no one's got any savings because they've got 5.5 kids per woman, the banks then have got so little cash to lend out that if anyone wants that cash, they say, whoa, well, if you're going to borrow this tiny amount of money I've actually got in the bank, you're going to have to pay 20%, 25%. And that's not enough to build roads. It's too much to build a road. It's too much to build a profitable electricity sector. It becomes a loss-making electricity sector. Entrepreneurs can't borrow money from the bank. Now, if you go back to Europe in the 19th century, as part of this time-traveling thing, they had the same problem, Europe. They had high fertility, and they didn't have much capital. And I'm actually arguing in the book, this is where communism, the whole concept of communism came from, because people like Marx said, you've got this massive population, you've got a small amount of capital. How's this ever going to change? It's just going to leave people in poverty, and there's going to be more and more people, and there'll be more and more poverty, and eventually there'll be a revolution. Now, actually, what happens is companies make a little bit of profit, and they reinvest it. You might go to your friends and your family and borrow that little bit of cash. You might be lucky enough to know someone who's gone off to the great land of America, like a lot of English people did, or the Irish did in the 19th century, and maybe they send a bit of money back. But it's really slow growth. And it was slow growth. 19th century industrialization Europe was super slow. And what the Asians have shown is that you can massively speed that up by getting fertility rates down. Now, I would argue China, probably Korea, has gone a bit too far. They've tried to speed it up too much, and that's going to backfire. But you've got to have the savings to go with it too. And this is where that fertility argument comes in.
Yeah, and I guess the point you're driving home here is simply that if you have 5 kids to take care of, how much money can you save? I mean, it's you. If you have to put these kids through school, you have to provide food for these kids. By the end of the month, even if you have a good wage job, a job that pays you well, with 5 kids, there's very little to save. And because the low local savings, then for governments looking to build infrastructure or for businesses looking to start, you're forced to look overseas, right? You're forced to look elsewhere where it might not be the best terms, but it's slightly better than the terms you can get for capital at home. Which brings, sorry, you were going to say something?
Well, I mean, there are 1 or 2 other options, and
okay.
One is to go the full communist hog and take over the entire financial system, take over all the savings. So any savings get taken by the government, and they allocate it into infrastructure in a very directed way. And communism does that. Ethiopia, I think, has done a pretty good job with that sort of system. But it still doesn't increase the volume of savings. China's got deposits in the banking system, 200% of GDP? And Nigeria or Uganda, Tanzania, about 20%. So it's just the scale, even if you go full communist and take all those 20% of GDP deposits, you still can't do anything like as much as what China has achieved through this lower fertility policy.
This is again. If you have any questions, please send them on Twitter. Is #CGD Talks. It's also on YouTube. You can send your questions for us. So we're talking to Charlie Robertson, Chief Economist, Renaissance Capital. His book is The Time-Travelling Economist: Why Education and Fertility Are Key to Escaping Poverty. I want us to talk a little bit about something else, and then we'll move on. And this is this piece about. So when we complain about one of the explanations that we have, or at least one of the things we think contributes to our persistent poverty in Africa, is the cost of borrowing for us. That when we go to borrow externally, whether it's issuing Eurobonds or borrowing from a bilateral lender, that we, especially in the private markets, we get charged an African premium. There have been accusations from African governments that, that ratings agencies actually have a thing for us Africans, and they go after us and they downgrade us easily. How are these things connected? How is local savings connected to how we're rated by the ratings agency? And is there a bias? Are they looking at us differently than, say, Argentina?
So I'm very sure, but I would never say 100% sure because I don't work in these rating agencies. I don't have their model. But having looked at ratings for a whole host of countries for 25 years, I don't see that bias. I think I think it's slightly more annoying than that, which is that when you've got cash, you can borrow really cheaply. And this is true for banks lending to rich people. You're Donald Trump and you can, sorry, am I allowed to, I don't know if I'm allowed to say names like this. But anyway, if you're rich, you get beneficial treatment from the banks. And if you're poor, they're charging you that higher rate because they think you're gonna default. So you take Morocco, for example. They can borrow what I said 2% locally for like 1 year, but they can also borrow super cheaply in euros or dollars if they want. They don't really need to because they've got so much local savings because their fertility rate went to about 2.5 kids back in the 1990s. So they got loads of local savings. But the thing is, the Moroccans can say, okay, I can borrow 2% 1 year local in local currency, dirham, or I can go and borrow, well, you foreigners try and charge me more than 2.5, and I'll just say, forget it. And they can do that, and it's credible. But when you're in Nigeria today, government revenues are 5% of GDP. Government tax revenues, in the States, Western countries, it's 40-50% of GDP is going in taxes and revenues to the government. Nigeria is about 5%. Nigeria doesn't have that much cash. And they go to the banks and they say, how much will you lend us to? And they lend us out. And banks are saying, well, we're a small banking system, really. So we're going to charge you at least 10-20%. So when Nigeria then goes to the markets, the international markets, and says, can I borrow money, please? The markets are saying, well, this is risky. You haven't got a huge amount of revenues. You also haven't got an awful lot of choice. So if it goes wrong paying back the dollar funding, you're not going to be able to borrow instead from your local banks because they also don't have a huge amount of cash. So you are a riskier credit. And I think that explains the.
You think this is primarily what drives what drives this, and countries like Morocco actually have a choice that a country like Nigeria doesn't.
Yeah.
And
they've given themselves that choice. That's the point. And it's within the reach, not of a president with a 5-year term. Unfortunately, you can't get fertility rate.
This is the next point that I wanted you to talk about, because when you started, you talked about it, but then you just skipped forward. There is a lag, right? How long on average is the lag, whether it's for fertility or it's for education? Is it 20 years? Is it 25 years? When do we begin to reap the benefits of high literacy, low fertility? When do we begin to see the benefits?
On the education side, I think you'll see it now. And actually, if you look at kind of some of the fastest growing economies for the last 10, 20 years globally, African countries keep on being in that group. And I think it's because the education's got there. And I think that lag that you're talking about when do my local savings boom, that's why I think we'll get there in 5 to 10 years in Kenya, Egypt, Ghana, and Ethiopia, interestingly. So in about 5 to 10 years' time, all of the United Nations is forecasting that their fertility rates will be dropping below 3 kids per woman. And at that point, the data tells me that the bank deposits jump from an average 30% of GDP. At about 3 to 4 kids, it's about 30% of GDP. 5 kids, like in Nigeria, it's 20% of GDP. So it's 30% at 3 to 4 kids, and it doubles to 60% at 2 to 3 kids. So I would expect to see really rapid growth in the banking system locally in Egypt and Kenya and Ghana and Ethiopia starting in 2030, possibly a bit earlier. But governments can obviously do things to.
They can accelerate that process. They can do things to make that to speed that up a bit.
And not the one-child policy.
Yeah, definitely not. We're definitely not going to one-child policy. But one of the things that I wanted you to talk about also, again, you're listening to Charlie Robertson talk about his book, The Time-Travelling Economist, here at the Center for Global Development. If you have questions, please, what is it? Hashtag CGD Talks. Why do you think Egypt is going to pass Nigeria? I mean, this is one of the things that so there's a chart that has been shared a lot on WhatsApp, and it is a chart that shows the top 10 economists in Africa, say maybe like 10 years ago or 8 years ago, and then the top 10 economists now. And the weird thing you see is that Egypt keeps rising and Nigeria keeps falling to such an extent that Egypt is now higher than Nigeria, and Nigeria isn't even listed in there anymore. And in your piece, you say that Nigeria is the largest economy now, larger than South Africa, but you predict that Egypt is going to be bigger. Why?
Already by 2030, because firstly they've got that over 70% adult literacy at which you can industrialize. And I was literally just talking to an Egyptian lawyer about 3 hours ago at an Africa conference here in London. And he said the Chinese, the Japanese are now looking at Egypt and saying, okay, we could set up factories here, 3,500 people perhaps at this one site that they're talking about. So Egypt's got the literacy of 74% in the about 2-year-old data. The electricity, plentiful. They had a bit of a socialist, semi-communist system back in the 70s and the 80s. And one of the consequences of that, I think, is that they prioritized a bit of investment, quite a significant amount of investment into the electricity sector. So they've got electricity, they've got education, and the fertility rate, weirdly, interestingly, actually got to about 3 kids per woman in 2000, and then kind of ticked up again to about 3.5. But what that means is they've got a particularly large banking system for their fertility rate. They've actually already got about 60% of GDP in deposits in the banking system. So they've got local cash. And if the government can cut its budget deficit, so it isn't borrowing at all, that could get redirected into the private sector. So you've got educated people, electricity, and actually a chunky amount of deposits. Nigeria is really hard to generalize about, and I would almost advise people not to do so, because the literacy rates vary dramatically.
From state to state.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're going to be broad about it, you'd say the North has a bigger problem of 40, 50, 60% literacy rates, can't industrialize yet. You can build factories there. This is a bit like the Italians tried to do in Italy in the 1950s. They tried to build factories in southern Italy. But the adult literacy rate was 50, 60%. They became dinosaur factories. The competitive factories were in the north of Italy, where the more literate Italians were. And anyway, point being is the education numbers are not great in the north, much better in the south. On average, the country's at 60, but you could see industrialization in the south. Electricity is a real mess. They're at half the level they need to industrialize at the moment. And this is all, I would argue, stemming from a lack of capital that comes about from an average fertility rate for the country of about 5.5. So they don't have enough savings. The education rates across the country is not high enough, and the power is just not there. So they can grow per person at about 1 to 2% a year, GDP, 1 to 2% per person a year. And the Egyptians should be moving towards the 3% a year or even higher, which is really well linked, by the way, to the share of the population who are adults versus dependents. So if you go back to Asia in the 1970, half of Asia were kids, half were adults. China was a mess, Cultural Revolution. India grew really slowly, 1% a year, a bit like Europe in the 19th century. And Southeast Asia was at war. Now, you move forward to today, about 2/3 of the population are adults in Asia. That's a lot more of the population can now work, just 1/3 of kids. And as a result, you start to get 3, 4, 5% per capita GDP growth. Now, as an average continent, and again, there's a massive variation within Africa on this, but it's about 50% adults, 50% kids. So you would expect growth to be about 1.5, maybe 2% per capita. Is what the data tells us since 1960 for all countries in the world.
This is fascinating. So we are in 2020 in Africa. We're about where Asia was in 1970.
And there's differences as there was in Asia then. So Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore were already beginning to mark themselves apart in the 1970s. Already, you asked, what's the time lag here? Korea got its literacy up to about, well, they claim about 90, 95%. by 1960. By 1970, by 1972, they were an industrial country. 20% of GDP was industry. By 1980, they were already thinking about the next shift from textiles into heavy industry, Daewoo, car manufacturing. And by 1990s, they were doing it. So it took 30 years to do a most incredible progression from being poorer than Ghana in 1960 to being most of the way towards being the Korea we know now, which is one of the biggest industrial exporters in the world.
People in sort of a glib way, when they want to emphasize how poor and persistently poor Africa's been, they like to compare Korea with Ghana. About 1950, 1960s, that they were comparable, or Ghana was richer than Korea in terms of per capita, just GDP in general. But as you're saying, a huge difference was literacy rates. What they were in Korea then and what they were in Ghana, and fertility rates and what they were in Ghana and what they were in. So one of your kids you made the presentation to, if you show them the data, looking at the two countries and ask them, one of them is larger than the other now, which one is going to be rich 10, 20 years from now? They would have picked, knowing what we've discussed today, they would have picked Korea. But
Absolutely.
I think, what then are the options that are available to us? I mean, one of the things that you talked about is the experience of the Philippines, right? In terms of when you have, you have a mixture where you have some good education, not good education, high fertility, low fertility. So it's getting to that point. What happens in the interim? What happens with immigration? Well, we see it locally. You talked about it, how the people with education in the Nigerian villages, almost all of them went to the cities. Is there a replica on the global stage where people go where labor is required, where they have marketable skills? Can you talk to us a bit about the role of immigration in here?
Yeah, if the fertility and the education numbers are not aligned, then you see this emigration wave. And you saw it. The Philippines is a really interesting example because there was a great book called How Asia Works by Philip Studwell or something, but really good.
Yeah, his name is Joe Studwell. It's right
that's
here.
it, Joe Studwell.
Okay.
Really, it's great. It's a lovely read. And he says literacy is just not that important. Look at the Philippines. He wrote this in 1997. He said, look at the Philippines, well educated for decades, and he's right, they were. But they haven't taken off. And I think it's because they still had a high fertility rate into the 1990s. And so they didn't have any local savings. So they didn't have electricity, or not sufficient amount of electricity and infrastructure to create the jobs that people need. So you've suddenly got a population that's well educated, but there's no capital to provide jobs. And the governments are never in a position to be able to provide all the jobs because they haven't got any money either. So people leave. And they left, in their hundreds of thousands, their millions. Remittances then back to the Philippines was the result. And what I'm suggesting is that we are seeing that situation unfold across a number of the countries. Tanzania, Uganda, all of them have adult literacy now of around 70 to 80%. They could industrialize.
But no job, no savings.
But no savings because the fertility rate's too high. Now, in Kenya, it'll be there in 5 or 10 years. If I believe the United Nations forecast for Tanzania, they're not going to be there until 2060 or 2070.
Because the fertility rates are still high?
That's what they're saying. The UN is currently forecasting we're going to be well over 3 kids per woman into the 2060s. So in 40 years' time, we could be having the same debate as I've had at every other conference for 10 years. Now, I'm hoping the new president does something about this. But the point being, so now when I go on holiday in Jordan, for example, people working now at the hotels are Kenyans. I wouldn't have seen that 20 years ago, but I see that now because they have the education that enables them to escape the kind of subsistence agricultural life. They can go and get jobs. They're just not so many jobs at home.
So at some point, so Kenya is there, and it appears, Uganda is there, that what we might see then, the next level of what we might see as literacy levels begin to level out on the continent, where almost every country in Africa is at 70% or more of adult literacy, then we're going to have that problem that Kenya has at the moment, where you have a highly educated population that is enough to be able to industrialize, but because of low savings, you can't. There's really no, there's not enough capital for you to be able to industrialize. And then we begin to see people seeking opportunities elsewhere.
And the person who's done the best work on this works with you at the Center for Global Development, Michael Clements.
Michael is in fact, one of the things that Michael argues, because when people try to link reducing immigration with improving economic conditions, is that in fact, when the economic conditions begin to improve, it spurs more immigration, and after a while, it stabilizes. And he uses, Europe, he uses Mexico as an example of being able to do that. So we're probably going to see that happening. But the why electricity? I want us to talk about that piece, because it seems intuitive, because you need to add value, whether it's agriculture, forest, or mineral products. You need to add some sort of value to them, and you need significant amounts of electricity. But why per capita consumption of electricity? How did you explain that?
That was so. The problem with trying to count power over centuries is that the form of power we've used has changed from wood to coal, which was the big story in the 18th, 19th century, to then oil and now electricity. And I'm being a bit naughty to just call it electricity, but I think that's where we're going. As we over 30 years cut down on fossil fuels, it'll all be about the electricity. And because the data makes it very easy to time travel. So, Ethiopia's electricity numbers they are still so low because they're only just starting up the Grand Renaissance Dam. But you can go back 40, 50, 60 years and say, the power's just not there yet for a big industrial revolution in East Africa. So what I've done is I've probably included a few too many tables, but one of them lets you have a look at the very latest electricity numbers per person and then jump around. And I'm linking it to even the English Industrial Revolution, which should have been the Scottish Industrial Revolution, because the Scots were much more literate than the English, much quicker. And maybe that's because of this Presbyterian religion thing, which took off in the late 17th century. And anyway, the Scots could all read and write before the English could. But it was the Industrial Revolution that started in England, because that's where the coal fields were. And the factories would get set up by the coal fields because that provided the cheap power. So you needed the literate Scots to migrate down to England and start working in the factories next to the coal plants. And some of that is in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is just, he go back 300 years, and we're seeing the importance of cheap, reliable power. And one of the things I was shocked by is that the cost of electricity across Africa, according to a World Bank report from 2014, so it's a few years out of date, was considerably higher than Europe. So the poorest continent is paying the highest costs for electricity. And I think it's related to the savings issue. That when you can finance electricity plants with 2% interest rates, you can make the electricity cheap and plentiful.
Charlie, I will come back to that, but you described the structural transformation process, that the person who's now, who's literate and is no longer doing subsistence farming, obviously he's not ready to build machines just simply because he can read and write 4 sentences. But the next stop for this person, usually, at least in the pattern that we've seen, is in the textile manufacturing sector, right? That's where he's going to go. And you said, when this makes sense, that if you have, load shedding, it's going to be difficult to compete with Chinese factories, right? If you have the guy who is coming to work in the factory and still expects to go back to the farm to harvest, you're not going to be able to compete with And which brings us to this point that previously the latter was that you came out of subsistence agriculture and went into some sort of light manufacturing, maybe textiles, and eventually you go into heavy manufacturing. But with the increased use of machines in manufacturing and the increased automation, would that, I mean, there's talks about deindustrialization. There's talk about that by the time Africa gets there, that spot will no longer be available for African countries. What do you think about this?
It's a fair question, and it's partly I got concerned by reading an article in the Financial Times just a few months ago about Malaysia, where I think it's Sony decided they were going to put robots in to do these TVs. And the minimum wage in Malaysia is only a few $100s a month. And so the average wage is probably double that, say $600 or $700 a month. And already they're saying it's worthwhile putting in robots instead. And this is quite, Sony TVs are, they're not really basic stuff. So I am concerned about that. I guess on the positive side, the cost of robots versus the labor gains that you get in textiles still seems way in excess of what the robots are not competitive at the moment. And the second issue, or the third issue related to this, is hopefully the cost of power itself is going to come down through the technology, which we've already seen in solar, where costs of solar panels have just plummeted. So perhaps even the limited amount of electricity you need might be getting cheaper. And the textile workers in Bangladesh are still so competitive that they make a good profit even before thinking about the robots. I do worry about it.
Yeah, but this is a fair point. My colleague Vij and Ramachandra and Alan Gelb did a study, and what they found was that industrial labor in Africa, which is weird because when you go to Africa, you think there's just plentiful labor. What they found was that industrial labor in Africa was significantly more expensive. That for African countries to be competitive in terms of labor, they had to match or beat Bangladesh. The country that came closest to matching or beating Bangladesh was actually Ethiopia. Both Ghana, Senegal, and it was around $900, $972 or something like that per year, right? But Ghana, Senegal, Kenya were significantly higher than that. So African countries ought to look at Bangladesh, put Bangladesh up on the wall, and be like, we're going to beat Bangladesh, and be able to. But which brings us, as we begin to wrap up, excellent book, really, really for people who are interested in, for policymakers who are looking to solve these long-term problems of how you transition your country out of this poverty, persistent poverty. And it's actually within the capacity of countries to do, because I went to an event on Emerging Markets Forum, and the guy said that, in Asia, it's slightly easier because there were always examples that other Asian countries could look at and be like, we want to be like those guys. That we need an example. But Mauritius and Botswana are too small for you need like a Kenya or Ghana, right, to break through, and then we'll be like, okay, everyone is going after Kenya, everyone is going after Ghana, like an example like that. And you say we'll probably get there with Kenya in like 5 years with the fertility thing. So we'll see what happens to Kenya in a decade if Kenya can beat that. But what can governments do to enhance this process? Definitely not one-child policy. We're definitely not Korea. But what can governments do, especially insofar of the role of women in the economy? Because that helps. What can partners do? So we have a whole industry called development that is based around getting countries to be better, that they're not as poor anymore. What can development partners do? What they can't do? What is the combination of policies or a suite of policies that allows us to speed up this process slightly more faster than it's going now?
I suspect it's one could talk for hours about that, and it gets done. So just the lessons from this book are trying to narrow them. to say, first on education, I think governments should consider doing the adult literacy campaigns that Korea did in the 1950s, when they got their literacy rate from about 30% in the late 1940s to about, they claimed, 90% by 1960. So 30% to 90% in about 10, 15 years. Even Stalin didn't quite get that big an increase in Soviet Russia, and used to get shot if you didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. So, you might not believe the numbers exactly in Korea, but certainly they did it very fast. But it was through adult literacy campaign of getting adults back into school again. That really makes a difference. Cuba did it. I read a lovely book about the Brigadista or something year of some kind of school kids going out and teaching old people how to read and write. And Cuba did it in a year. They started from a very high base, but adult literacy campaigns would be good. Making sure that everybody stays at school and gets a decent education, at least literacy, ideally much better. It's still not. It's nearly achieved everywhere, but it's still not achieved everywhere. So, and keeping gender equality on this, letting girls do as well as boys, because it then feeds into the issue of the fertility issue too. That if a girl is still at school at 14 or 15, she's not having a kid. She's not having a second kid at 17, perhaps a third kid at 20, 21, because she's been at school until she's 17 or 18. And so the difference between a girl who's on a third kid at 21 or maybe the first kid at 21 is a fertility rate change of 2 kids per woman. That's enough to go from 5 kids like Nigeria has today to 3. So just keeping girls at school till 18 can make a big difference. And then on the fertility front, the biggest driver, well, the best graph I saw, and which is in the book, is the one of looking at child mortality versus fertility rates. 11% chance of dying if you're under 5 in Nigeria. And COVID, we had that terrible spending trillions because of a 1 to 2% fatality rate, unvaccinated people, mostly, as we know, with the elderly, but 1 to 2% roughly on average. 11% chance of dying just by being born Nigerian. And this isn't a wealth. Wealth is not the explanation here, because per capita GDP in Nigeria is the same as Venezuela. It's the same as Ghana. And yet their child mortality rates are vastly lower. And if you get much lower child mortality rates, you have much lower fertility rates. Because if you're not worried about losing a child, you can afford to have more. Yep, and then invest more in them, because they're going to live. They're going to survive, and you invest in their education for 10 years, 15, maybe even 20 years, and that will reap the reward that you would hope. And then a bit of a family planning campaign works as well. Ethiopia's tried it, loads of governments have tried it, and it does make some difference. Just telling people, 6 kids, your grandparents did it, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do everything your grandparents did.
Yeah, hopefully not.
My grandparents, and my parents were born in the 60s, so, they're around in the 60s, definitely didn't want to repeating everything they did. So, yes, all of that.
Charlie, it's been a really we're I mean, really good conversation on this. And on the adult literacy thing, there was a time when I was growing up, my mom used to go to night school. And I was in 6th grade, and I used to come home and teach my mom sometimes. All right. I think my mom's forgotten that because she didn't do it consistently enough. But there was a time when it was a thing, when almost all the adults went to night school, especially the ones who were not literate. They went and I think if governments do that, before I go to that, there's a question I had. Why is it 70% industrialization? Why do we begin to see industrialization at 70% or more? Is there a reason why? Is there a connection? Why
that came from this woman, Mary Jean Bowman, who noticed that in the 1960s when she was looking at the European industrial revolutions. And she said 40%, below 40%, you don't grow sustainably. So then you get the discontented population of Guinea probably backing the coup and Mali, probably for a little while anyway, backing the coup because they're just so unhappy about the state of their economy. So under 40%, you don't even grow. 70 to 80, you do. But one thing I found interesting about this is that it's very common to not recognize how important literacy is, even to escape subsistence agriculture. So Adam Smith, the father of economics 300 years ago, he doesn't talk about it. I think he took for granted that everyone could read and write because in Scotland in his day they could. And he just said you need to have dexterous fingers. That's all you need to work in a textile mill. And I still read that from economists writing today in the last 10 years. You just need dexterity. You don't need to be able to read and write. But weirdly you do. And you need just a very high proportion of the population to be able to read and write. And quite why? I don't know.
Well, just intuitively from our own experience, we keep talking about the expansion of the digital economy. As to function properly in the digital economy, you have to be a bit literate, right? I don't know, maybe not, but people talk about. One of my colleagues at Center for Global Development, Rose Crozier, does research on space. And where we are now in Africa is about taking all of that data that you get from space and making it into usable pieces that you can send people, whether it's farmers or fishermen. Well, you have to send it to them in a way they can digest, in a way that they can use the information and the data be useful to them. So I think going back, the literacy thing really, really drives home that point. And we talked about this from the beginning, but before we close here, who did you write this book for? Like who's the target audience for this book? I used to be in government, but I'm sitting at a think tank now, and I love it because for me it shows me things that I wish I knew when we were in government, right? The combination. It wasn't that we didn't know education is important or low fertility rate is important, but seeing the combination and interacting with each other in a way that you bring it together here would have been useful. So who's the target here? Is it the World Bank? Is it the governments? Is it who or is it some guy in the street at a pub?
To be fair, it's probably for the people asking these questions at conferences in Nairobi and in Lagos and Abuja and Kigali, wherever I've been, Pakistan actually is, and the questions are the same and the frustration is the same. And when it's not clear, until I did all of this work for 25 years, I paid no attention to demographics. This is not me being kind of clever now. It was very recent that I've worked this out. For a long time I was struggling to understand, why are interest rates so high in Kenya? The banks are ripping people off. It must be the foreigners doing something. Somebody's doing something wrong somewhere. Was my, I couldn't explain it, and now it feels like I've got a model that does explain things, so that people can then focus on what can be done, and to not kind of shoot for the moon when the smaller ambitions can make a bigger difference and really transform life for your kids or your grandchildren. So it feels to me this is written for Pakistanis, it's written for Kenyans, it's written for Nigerians. But financial investors will see a benefit. They'll know which countries are more likely to default, as in the late 20th century. In fact, as always, it'll be the high fertility countries that are more likely to default. You'll get a few low fertility countries, but it's rare. So, it helps bankers too, but that, should have been my first goal, perhaps, given my job. But no, it's not. It's about, I just want to see people see their countries boom over a number of decades in the way that I've seen some others like India do it or Singapore do it.
Charlie, it's been such a pleasure having you here at CGD. It's been a pleasure working with you ever since met you and became familiar with your work. For a really, really good way of explaining these things to audiences that might not even appreciate technical language or understand the technical language, but break it down. On behalf of me and my colleagues here, everyone working behind the scene, I want to thank you. Unless you had one last thing to add.
My last thing to add is I want to thank you. I want to thank you because you have helped me understand the challenges of what it is to be a government minister,
And I'm in
of
the
having
book.
to weigh up. And you're in the book.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, you do totally deserve to be, because you just show what an impossible choice you get confronted with sometimes.
This is why. But Charlie, thank you, man. It's been great talking to you, and have a good rest of the week. And the video will be up. We'll post the video up on our website. It'll be available on YouTube, and then hopefully people who didn't get a chance to listen to us do it live get a chance to watch the video. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.